If you have a completed 3D model and you want to use Vehicle Framework to add it to Subnautica, this video is for you. Here you can see I have the completed 3D model for a submersible. In this folder, I have all the textures for this model. This is important because, in my experience, textures and materials rarely import correctly from Blender into Unity. I'm going to export my 3D model as a .fbx file because I find it easy to work with in Unity. I'm going to leave these at the default settings, so auto and with this off. And then I'm just going to hit export FBX. Now in this folder, I have the 3D model and the textures. At this point, I'm ready to create a Unity project. Before I can do that, I need to make sure I have the right version of the Unity editor. You can see here, the correct version is Unity 2019.4.36. More recent editor versions can be installed in Unity Hub. But this version is part of the Unity archive. The Unity archive can be found here. We'll go to 2019.4.36 and hit install in order to add it to Unity Hub. With the right version of the Unity editor installed, we're ready to create a project. Make sure the right version of the Unity editor is being used. Give the project a descriptive name and create it. In my new Unity project, the first thing I'm going to do is delete the camera and the directional light. I don't want these getting exported later. The second thing I'm going to do is to import my model and the textures. With all of my assets imported, I'm going to start by creating a new prefab for this vehicle. As you can see, the model already looks pretty good. In my experience, it has happened frequently that the materials do not import correctly. I think it is important that I import the materials and the 3D model at the same time. In the past, I've had to manually create a new Unity material for every Blender material. In order to do that, you can right-click in this window, Create Material. Instead of creating a new material, I'm going to show you how you would make one by showing you one that's already been made. If I select an object on the submarine, I can see that it has material 21. I can click material 21 to make it show up in the inspector, and you can see how it has the defined albedo and normal map. I can click the albedo to show the texture that's using. If I were creating the material, I would drag the texture from the asset window into this tiny square here. But none of that is necessary because I was careful in the way I imported it. Ultimately, I'm going to export this prefab as an asset bundle to load into Subnautica. But before I can do that, there are two things I need. The first is to set up my Unity editor to export asset bundles, and the second is to add some game objects to the submarine necessary for Vehicle Framework. To set up the Unity editor to export asset bundles, in the asset window we'll return to assets and we'll create a new folder here with the exact name. I mistakenly named the folder script when I should have named it editor. we'll enter script, and then we will create a C# script called build asset bundles. And then I can open up that script by double clicking it. I'm using Visual Studio 2019 because it's the same year as the archived Unity editor. In order to get the body of this script, I'm going to visit a reference. This is a guide I wrote for this purpose. The body of the text is below. I'm going to copy the whole text and paste it into my editor. I'm going to select everything with Control A and paste it in with Control V, save it with Control S. After doing so, a new button will appear under Assets at the very bottom called Build Asset Bundles. But don't click it now because we're not ready to use it and it won't do anything anyway. Now our Unity editor is ready, but we need to set up our prefab for Vehicle Framework. In order to do that, I will visit another reference. This is another guide I wrote for this purpose. It covers the process of adding certain new game objects and components to the vehicle in order to make them work correctly with Vehicle Framework. I want to be sure I'm not editing the game object in the scene, but instead editing the prefab. In order to do that, I'll double click it in the asset window here. The first thing I'm going to do is to rename this object model. This isn't necessary, but it helps me keep track of what is what. I need to create two new game objects called modules root and storage root, just like this. These two objects will be the parents of any upgrade modules or storage items you place in the vehicle during gameplay. Next, I'm going to create an object with a special name. Any Unity light components that we add to the submarine should be children of the light's parent, and the light's parent should have this exact name. The special name of light's parent is for compatibility with another mod called tweaks and fixes. Even though this submarine model doesn't have any lights, I'm going to add two just to show you how to do it. At this point, I've prepared the transform hierarchy, but all of these are empty game objects. The volumetric light component will remain an empty game object. Its presence is necessary to create the visible cone of light that you see when you are outside a vehicle. Also notice that every game object under light's parent has the word light in its name. That's another special naming convention for Vehicle Framework. When a game object has light in its name, Vehicle Framework knows to not apply any shader to it. Now I'm going to drag the headlights into position on the submarine, and I'm going to make them on the front of those oxygen tanks. Now I'm ready to add the light component. I'll do it like this. Because these are meant to be headlights, I'm going to change the type of the light to a spotlight. You can tweak the light in the editor like this. The next object I'm going to add is the water clip proxy, and I'm going to start with an empty game object like usual. The purpose of the water clip proxy is to ensure the surface of the ocean does not clip into the submarine. I will create the water clip proxy by covering the interior of the submarine in a cube like this. One large cube like this will be enough to give the player a consistent viewing experience inside the sub, but it may create some strange visual behavior from outside the sub. For that reason, you might want to model the interior more closely, and you can do so by using multiple cubes like this. I've increased the resolution of the water clip proxy a small amount. Higher definition may be more visually appealing, but oftentimes it's good to keep it simple. I'm going to finish the water clip proxy by removing every component except for the transform in these game objects. Only the transform is required for vehicle framework, and those other things will get in the way. The next game object I'm going to make is like the water clip proxy. It's called the bounding box. The bounding box should completely cover the vehicle, and it will be used by the build bots to circumscribe the vehicle. The bounding box should have exactly one 3D box collider that circumscribes the vehicle. I can create it like this. Now I want to be sure I delete all the unnecessary components of the bounding box and disable the box collider. The next game object I'm going to make is the pilot seat. I'm going to start with an empty game object like usual. The pilot seat will be where the player's camera is while they are piloting the vehicle. Remember that forward in Unity is in the positive Z direction, and that's shown in the blue arrow here. So I'm going to place this arrow about where I think it should be. The next game object I'm going to make is a hatch. Like usual, I'm going to start with an empty game object. I want the player to be able to click the hatch, so I'm going to add a box collider. The way I've set this up, the player should be able to click anywhere on the glass dome in order to get in the vehicle. The hatch is also going to need a child game object that will specify to where the player will exit when they leave the vehicle. I will simply drag this transform where I think it should go. The next game object I need is the upgrades interface. I'll start with an empty game object like usual. The player will click the upgrades interface in order to add and remove upgrade modules to the vehicle. Because I want the player to click it, I'm going to start by adding a box collider. This vehicle model doesn't have an obvious choice, so I'm going to use the back propeller. The next game objects I'm going to create are the batteries. Again, this model doesn't have an obvious choice, but I'm going to use the gas tanks here. The next game object I'm going to add are two internal storage containers. These are just like the batteries, so I'm actually going to start by copying the batteries. With this, the player will be able to click either of these two small propellers to open a storage container. The final game object I'm going to create is the collision model, and I'll start with an empty game object like usual. The collision model will make our vehicle a solid object in the world of Subnautica. This is important so that fish cannot swim into the vehicle, and the vehicle cannot move through terrain. In order to create the collision model, I'm going to cover the vehicle in box colliders, like this. I know the turbines in the gas tanks already have colliders associated with them, so I don't need to add any more. The last thing I want to do is delete the renderers from these cubes, like this. At this point, I'm ready to export my asset bundle. In order to do so, I'll exit from the prefab view. Now I'll select my prefab, and I'll add it to an asset bundle in the bottom right corner here. Now I can build the asset bundle using the script I added before. I'll click Build Asset Bundles under the Asset tab. I made a mistake earlier. My Build Asset Bundles script failed because I named the folder the wrong name. It's not scripts, it's capital E Editor. Now I can really go to the Assets tab and use Asset Bundles. Once the asset bundle is built, I can locate it by right-clicking in the Assets window, Show in Explorer, Assets, Asset Bundles, and here it is, the one that has type File. Of all of these files, you can identify which one has your model in it by its size. I'll start by creating a folder in the plugins directory here. And then I will move my asset bundle into that folder. Now that my assets are prepared, I have to write and compile some C# for this mod. So in Visual Studio 2019, I'll create a new project. I want the template to be a class library. I'll give the project a descriptive name. It's also important that I use .NET Framework 4.7.2. In my Visual Studio project, the first thing I want to do is add references. At the very least, I know I'm going to need Harmony, BepInEx, and Vehicle Framework, so I'll start there. I'm going to rename this class after my vehicle. And I'm going to make sure my new vehicle is aware of Vehicle Framework. Now I'm going to declare that my vehicle is of a Vehicle Framework type. It becomes highlighted in red, so I'll hover it to see what's wrong. I forgot to add a reference, so I'll add that now. With that reference added, I'll hover it again, and I can see that I forgot another reference. Now I've dealt with some of the problems, but some more remain. These are methods we must implement so that Vehicle Framework can work correctly. Most of them will refer to game objects we added in Unity. The easiest way to progress now is to right-click on the type, go to Quick Actions and Refactorings, and implement the abstract class. This will create empty references to all the necessary parts, which allows us to easily fill them in. The first one I'm going to do is the storage root object, because it's a simple example. I'll start by creating a get function, and I'm just going to return transform.find storage root, which is the name we gave that object in Unity. However, Vehicle Framework requires a game object, so I can return that like this. Now I can very easily do modules root object. A few other members are simple like this, so I'll do them now. These are the members that only require a simple game object. The vehicle model, the collision model, these root objects, and the bounding box. Since I'm done with these, I'm just going to hide them from now by hitting Ctrl M, Ctrl O. Of the remaining members, perhaps the next simplest is the water clip proxies. So I'll start to do it now. I start by creating a get function. And this time I want to return a list of objects. So I'm going to start by creating a new list of type GameObject. And then I'm going to iterate over the children in the GameObject that we called water clip proxies. Canopy windows is also a list of GameObjects, so I'm going to use the same template. However, in this vehicle there's only one canopy window, so I'll add it like this. Notice I used a / in this find call. That's because this is a to-transform path in the transform hierarchy. Remember that in our prefab, we had a GameObject called model, and that had a GameObject called sub11texture. Sub11texture is the glass ball. Next, I'm going to do innate storages, and I'm going to use a reference to do so. This example shows how to add one storage, but I'd like to add two. I need to make sure these names are unique, so I'll do that now. As well, these transform paths aren't correct, so I'll fix them now. In a similar way, I can complete the modular storages, but I don't actually want any of those on this vehicle, so I will not create any storage containers. Now I'll do the upgrades, and again I'll continue by example. Again, this path isn't correct, so I'll fix it now. Now I'll do the batteries, and again I'll continue by example. These names aren't correct, so I'll fix them now. That's all I have to do for the batteries, so now I'll do the vehicle headlights. And I have to correct the names. Now I'll quickly do the pilot seat and the hatches. For the pilot seat, the seat has the collider that you touch, and the sit location is where the player's head will actually be. Okay, that's the last time we'll have to reference GameObjects. Our vehicle doesn't have arms, so we'll simply return false, and vehicle framework can't handle arms anyways. I would like this submarine to have 4 upgrade slots, so we'll return 4. The mass of the vehicle will determine how it moves as a physics object, and to choose, we can use this reference. This vehicle is even smaller than the Seamoth, so I'm going to use 500. For the max health, I can also use a reference. This vehicle is quite lightweight, so I'll use 150. The base crush depth is when the vehicle will begin taking damage, and I can use this reference. I don't want this vehicle to be too overpowered in the story, so I'll let it be 200. I can also set the value of the upgrades like this. Every vehicle framework vehicle can have 3 crush depth upgrades, and by default they're each at 300, but you could change them here if you'd like. As it is now, this vehicle will barely be able to get to the Lost River. The encyclopedia entry and the description are strings that will be used in the PDA, so I can fill them out like this. the description will appear in a small text when you're about to build the vehicle. The description for that reason should be a relatively short sentence, but the encyclopedia entry can be a page long. I'm not going to supply a unique ping sprite right now, so I'm just going to return null. To fill out the recipe, which is the list of components you need to build the vehicle, I'm going to use an example. At this point, I've filled out every member. The way I wrote it assumes we already have the game object, but we actually still need to retrieve it from the asset bundle. So I'm going to start like this. Now I'm going to write a method that can be used to grab my asset bundle from file. I added the getAssets method, and it's missing some references, but please notice that my submersible here corresponds to the path to the asset bundle file. So if this were in another folder, this would need to have a / just like when we were working with the transform hierarchy. As well, vehicle name here is the name of the prefab inside the asset bundle. I'm going to add these references. Just so it's clear, path comes from system.io, assembly comes from system.reflection, and asset bundle comes from the asset bundle module here. Finally, instead of returning this, I'm going to return model. This depends on getAssets being called before the vehicle model is retrieved, but that won't be a problem. Now I'm going to create an entry point for our mod in the game. I'm going to do so by adding a class, and out of convention I'm going to call it mainPatcher. I already have the contents of this mostly prepared, so I'll paste them in like this. I'm missing a lot of references, so I'll start by changing my using statements. It looks like I don't have mono behavior reference, so I need to add Unity engine. The next thing I'm going to do is fix the name of my submarine. Here. And here. I'm actually going to write my register function here. So I'm going to delete this reference and add the function like this. I'm missing a lot of references, so I'll add them up here. I'm missing a reference to UWE, so I'll add that here. I don't have the type definition for IEnumerator, so I'll add that here. In the register function, model should refer to the game object that is actually our vehicle. So I'm going to change that like this. I don't have a reference to the vehicle registrar, so I need to add a new reference like this. Finally, there are some references to plugin info, which doesn't exist. That's actually a file we're going to create. I'll do so by again adding a class with that name. I can fill out its contents like this. And I can make it public and static so that it's available everywhere. I'll change this to my vehicle name, and of course your name. And I'll name the plugin as well. And I'll save that. Now when I return to my main patcher, everything should look okay. Okay, this should be everything we need to do. We may have made some mistakes, but we're going to build it now and test it out. To do so, I'm simply going to go to the Build tab and hit Build Solution. Down here, I can see that the build succeeded. Now that I've built the solution, I can find the result in the solution directory. That's here, so I'll go into New Vehicle Mod, into Bin, into Debug, and then I have to find the right one. and it's here. That's the name of our solution, .dll. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that into the mod folder I created in the plugins directory. Now I'm going to start the game. In the game, the best way to test is to go into a creative save or make a new one. In this case, I'll go into one I already have, and I'm going to try to spawn the vehicle. In order to try to spawn the vehicle, I'll hit Shift Enter to bring up the console, and I'll type spawn new vehicle. I wasn't able to spawn the vehicle, so I knew something went wrong. I was able to check the BepInEx log, and I found this output. It looks like I made a mistake with batteries. It seems like I got my capitalization wrong, so I'm going to fix that. Okay, now after having fixed a few more things that were told to me in the log, I'm going to try again. I can already see that I got the blueprints, so I'm just going to quickly try to spawn it. I realized my mistake was I had the wrong name. Okay. There it is, and it looks like I can touch it. I can touch the battery. I can edit the storage. I can edit the upgrades. And if everything is correct, it should be able to dock. So let's see if I can get in and drive. See if it can go in here. The animation looks a little funny, but everything's okay. Now this seems a little bit big compared to the cricket that I added to the game, but that's a simple matter of scale. At this point, if you want to change the model, you will have to re-export the Unity asset bundle. That's it for this video. Thanks for following along, and have fun.